Hi guys, welcome back. Now we are going to start the chapter on topic 6 right now, which will talk about the environment, implications that the environment has with impact that businesses have towards the environment, towards global warming, climate change, and efforts that companies and businesses can take to in efforts to solve all these problems. Okay, so let's get straight into the notes. We're going to talk about the environment. The learning objectives are as follows: to define ecology, including its meaning and significance, understand the traditional business attitudes towards the environment. Now, this is very important. So I would like you to sort of, if you can, highlight that in your notes. The attitudes that businesses have towards the environment that has encouraged environmental degradation and resource depletion. Identify the moral problems underlying businesses' abuse of the environment, including the question of externalities, problem of free riders, and the right to a livable environment. The cost of environmental protection. So this is the next phase of what we will study in this module, in this chapter. And the question of who should pay for them. Okay, who should handle the cost of environmental protection? And the methods of pursuing environmental goals, including things like regulation, incentives, pricing mechanisms, and pollution permits. Okay, so let's just talk about the environment as a starting point. We all are human beings. We use the Earth's natural resources for food, clothing, and shelter. And the level of industry that has fed our consumption has damaged all these resources. Mother Nature is a very fragile thing, and the sort of outputs that our industry has sort of developed and accumulated all these years, things like carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases, heat, pollution of water, land, sea, air. All these things have sort of damaged the natural resources that are available to us. Rivers and lakes are getting dirty, air is getting unclean, planet is warming up. The last 10 years has been the warmest ever recorded in history. Fragile ozone layer that we have protecting us from the sun's UV rays, that's also fraying. Forest is also disappearing. And of course, with them, countless of plant diversities and animals going extinct as well. Half of the world's wetlands have disappeared. If you don't know what wetlands look like, there's a visual after this, so don't worry. 80% of the world's grasslands are suffering from oil degradation. 20% of dry lands are in danger of turning drier and becoming deserts. And groundwater is seriously being depleted. So this is an example of what a dry land looks like. And if you can imagine what thrives on wetlands, what thrives on wetlands, your everyday animals like your cows, cattle, rhinos, for example, water buffaloes, things that we sort of rely on every day, and historically humans have relied on every day. And as all these areas become reused and repurposed to build things on, things like factories, for example, to have industries on, the resources for all these animals becomes lesser and lesser. Okay, and not to mention, because of the increase in greenhouse gases and the overall temperature of the Earth, climate change, ice sheets in the Arctic are melting as well. And you can see this graph as a result of climate change, right? If you see right there in Venice, right, the first country there is Venice, followed by Amsterdam, Hamburg, and Petersburg, and LA. You notice in the graph that if the seawater rises by 100 centimeters, 1 meter, in about 100 years it will rise about 100 meters. In about 100 years it will rise about 1 meter, which is 100 centimeter. And if it rises to that amount, a city like Venice will be totally underwater. It is very likely that none of us will be alive to see that. But if it keeps going on, say if it goes up by another 1 meter, Amsterdam is underwater. It goes up double that by 4 meters, you would see large cities in the world like LA and New York, all underwater. But if you're living in China, that's a long way to go. You're talking about 5, 6, 7 meters of rise of sea level water before it even puts cities like Shanghai and Edinburgh underwater. So it's a it's an interesting perspective. Although it's a long way to go, it's still possible to be part of the Earth's future. Okay, that's something that you need to really think about when it comes to environmental protection. We have no idea how long the future of Earth will be and the future of mankind will be. So, 100 years might not be that long to think about, to plan for, and it takes much more than that to repair the damage that we've done to the environment, the damage that businesses have done to the environment. So, the environment, as a result, caused the Earth to lose its capacity to continue to provide the goods we need. And it threatens our economic well being and ultimately our survival. And at this point, for the last 10, 20 years, or since the first time human being has ever sent a rocket into space, for example, we have also started to make a mess of outer space. If you look at this picture by National Geographic, all those small little dots that you see on screen are actually satellites. Okay, I'm not too sure if I can pull up the data here. Let me do that. Okay, so based on Wikipedia, right, there are currently over 2,218 satellites orbiting Earth. Okay, 2,218 satellites sort of roaming around Earth. Now, those are active satellites. Those are not satellites that are dead and not useless. There are plenty more satellites that are not being used. Okay, so we have a lot of junk in space. Put it that way. Okay, we have a lot of junk in space. A lot of things that we no longer use, and satellites are not meant to live forever. Okay, so even outer space, human beings are making a mess of, and not to mention the factories that we have around, especially on developing countries like the Bangladesh or the Thailands and the Vietnams. They have a lot of factories that produces a lot of things and a lot of gases, hazardous gases, and they all get pumped to the air, right? Granted, of course, there are regulations that help filter all those airs, but at the end of the day, it's still dangerous. It's still bad. Okay? So, chemicals used in agriculture also damage the environment. Chemical residues is present in the food that we consume, causing health concerns, particularly children who are at risk. And of course, large scale farming sort of increases all these problems. I'm not sure if I can pull up a data here. So, all these genetic farming problems, it reduces plant biodiversity, increase in problems like super pests. So, the reduction in farmers' independence caused by an increased reliance on agricultural corporations. Meat industry's ecological costs second only to those of the motor industry. People don't realize this, but actually it costs a lot of money and to sell meat, especially cattle and beef, it takes a lot of space. Okay, and those animals releases a lot of gases, and when they do, those get releases to the atmosphere, and thus it increases the temperature and the overall climate around the area. Okay, the more CO2 you pump in the air, the higher the temperature becomes. Okay, so the things like using a lot of pest control pesticides. Okay, using pesticides is there's a good and bad when it comes to using pesticides. There's a reason why they are called ecological narcotics. In other words, it's the nature's drugs. And what that means is that the more you use it, yes, the more you use it, you'll see a rise in yield, right? The more you use it, sort of spray all these pesticides, yeah, there won't be any pests that come and ruin your plants, but so you'll see a rise in yield. But eventually, the yield will drop again. And what that means is you have to spray more in order for the yield to go up. And what that means is that the more you use, the more you have to keep using. Make sure that the production output can keep up. And one of the biggest industries that use genetically modified materials are the cotton farming industry. And you notice that in this picture, you see a foreign worker sort of picking off the cotton, right? So its cotton industry is huge. And because of the fast fashion industry that we are in right now, with all these brands bringing up new clothes, new design week after week after week, and the prices of clothings in general, right, has gone down over the years. The inflation rate of clothing in general, of the clothing industry, or the fashion industry in general, has gone down through the years. Instead of other industries that have gone up, the cost have gone up. The cost of farming and clothing has actually gone down, and that's part of the reason, because people, the supply of clothing and in the fashion industry is going up so much that the production of cotton cannot keep up. At least it cannot keep up in the natural way. So what it does is, the cotton itself has to be genetically modified. That's why it's called GMO, genetically modified. The cotton itself has to sort of genetically modify. You re-engineer the plant so that it can produce more on a faster rate. Okay. Now it's a different topic altogether if you want to talk about whether such production is healthy or not. But it's the only way that this can be done in order to meet the demand of fast fashion clothing. But the problem of fast fashion clothing is that because it's so cheap, the consumers also see it as something that is not very valuable to keep. And as such, the output when it comes to the waste product of the fast fashion industry also increases exponentially. So just think about it in this way. When we buy clothing from H&M or Uniqlo, for example, sometimes we buy it at such a low cost, like $4.99 a t-shirt, $3.99 a t-shirt. We buy it at such a low cost that it doesn't make it difficult for us to think of throwing it away. Okay? Compare it comparatively in 10, 20 years ago, buying new clothes is typically related to a special occasion. Okay? We typically relate buying new clothes to things like Chinese New Year or Hari Raya or Deepavali or Christmas, right? Or we buy it on special occasions for someone's birthday, for example. So when we do buy those clothing, typically the prices land at about, you're talking anywhere between $20, $30, $60 sometimes, or even higher. You wouldn't really relate the idea of buying a t-shirt at $4.99 or $6.99 or $7.99. But you can do that now. When you walk into a shop like Uniqlo or H&M, you can surely buy a piece of clothing for that price level. And by making it so cheap, right? Of course, the quality is something else, but by making it so cheap, you're effectively creating the mentality that such clothing are not valuable, the perception that such clothing are not valuable, hence making it easier for people to discard it without thinking twice. And when you do that, right, the rubbish when it comes to all these things, the pollution level that is caused by all this output will go exponentially higher. And that's a problem. Okay, that's a problem for the fast fashion industry, causing all these issues, right? You see all these productions, all these sort of waste when it comes to the clothing. And these are textile cut-offs in Bangladesh, if you can read the report, right? So that's a big problem, and it's part of a big environmental problem in countries like that. Okay, causing a lot of pollution output as a result of waste from the textile and clothing industry. Okay, so it's always a big cycle. When the demand is there, you have to genetically modify the plant, okay, to produce more cotton. And the cotton goes on to produce more clothes, and the clothes goes on to be sold at a very cheap price. Okay? And people buy them, yes, but they also discard them very quickly. And when it's being purchased and discarded, remember I spoke about the mentality of capitalism, making what you use as things that you use up. Okay, we don't see clothings, at least not for the last 10, 20 years or so. We society don't really view clothing as something that is you use up. But now we see fashion and clothes as something that we sort of buy, maybe use for a couple of times, and then we can sort of donate or throw it away. And that's a very bad mentality, right? That's a very bad mentality. And of course, we talked about super pests earlier, causing all these issues. And not to mention, oil spill, right? Switching gears a little bit. These are some of the ecological disasters that humans have faced throughout the year. And the problem, what you're looking at the picture here is just a very small example of an oil spill. Okay, throughout history, there are major oil spills that has taken place, caused by companies like BP or ExxonMobil, and to a large extent, they did pay for the damages. But if you think clearly, you can never really repair the damages caused by an oil spill. The same applies for a nuclear leakage, a nuclear plant leakage. So, to talk a little bit about water, 70% of the world's water is used for irrigation. Irrigation here means for plantation, to sort of channel the water for natural resources, so on and so forth. So that's irrigation. For farming, that's irrigation. 22% is used for industries. So here talk about your factories and so on and so forth. 8% human consumption. Whether you're using it to bathe, whether you're using it to shower or to drink, that's human consumption. That leaves 1 billion people in the world to have lack access to clean water. We in Singapore, we are very fortunate to have access to very clean water. Some of you might not even notice it or know that it is actually safe to drink water directly from the tap in Singapore. I've done that and nothing has happened to me so far. Of course, granted that people always still take the safe approach of boiling the water first or having it go through a filter a few more times before they actually drink the water. It's actually safe to drink the water in Singapore, rest assured. 2.4 billion people in the world have no access to clean or to sanitization technology. That means they have access to water, but they have no access to the technology to clean water. Okay, so what that means is that to access clean water, they basically have to buy bottled water. That's not a very good thing, if you think about it, right? Rivers are, of course, being degraded. Intensive irrigation continued to cause ecological damages, increased water demand for city and irrigation use. Irrigation here in this context is also to clean the drainage of the city, reduce water flows owing to drought, conditions that have placed great pressure when it comes to the viability of water systems. The thing about water systems is that it's created to do a certain task. And while it can do it well, the thing about systems is that it gets damaged over the years, whether it's through corrosion or through increased or decreased water supply. So when the amount of people living within a certain city area increases exponentially, that system may not be able to sustain them throughout for a certain number of population. When it goes above a certain number of population, so they have to redo the system again. And this cannot continue for forever. Okay? And to do this, it costs money. And if you don't do it, it will cause further damage to the water systems within a particular area, right? So it's an ongoing problem that you don't really have a shortcut solution to. Okay? So you take a look at this example, right? The river Ganges in India, where it is widely considered, and it is actually considered as a holy river, a holy place, almost like a sanctuary for the people of India. It's almost sacred, the way they treat the river, because they use it for prayers, cleansing purposes. They use it to clean themselves, of course. They use it for a lot of festivities. So it's a big part of the Hindu religion over there in India. Okay, so to put things into perspective, that would sort of make you think that they would treat the river very well, and they do for a very to a very large extent. But that very same river, you sort of go down a couple of miles, is also the same river that they use for as a dumping ground. Okay, the same river that they use for pollution output, for secretion. Okay, and if you see clearly in the picture there, you still see people in there using the water for irrigation purposes, for some extent for human consumption. Okay, so this should not happen, where you can have the same population of people accessing one part of the river and treating it very well, same time another part of the same river being treated so poorly. Okay, from an ethical perspective, this should not happen. Okay, I hope you know by now, going into chapter 6, that ethically this is completely wrong and completely unethical for this to happen to humanity, right? You look at air pollution. Until recently, the United States was the greatest producer of greenhouse gases on both a per capita basis and on an overall basis. Per capita means per person, right? But Australia has overtaken the US on a per capita basis. That means on average per person, Australia generates 27.2 tons of carbon dioxide per year per person. 27.2 tons of carbon dioxide per year per person. That's a lot of greenhouse gases. And if you look at this graph right here, you compare the total emissions and the per capita per person, China naturally would be one of the highest because they are the largest economy in the world at this point. So China, but if you sort of average it out based on their population, China is not one of the highest. They actually fare very well in terms of per capita emissions. So they're actually under 5. A little bit above 5. Okay? And this is sourced from the Chinese National Bureau of Statistics. Look at Australia and where they fare. Okay, of course, total emissions, Australia is still quite low. But the emissions per person is one of the highest ever recorded. What does that really tell you in terms of this data? Okay, for one, is that although China is producing a lot of greenhouse gases as a country, its usage on a per person basis is not that bad. Its pollution on a per person basis, it's not that bad. Australia, although it's very low in its overall capacity, in its overall pollution rate as a country, on an individual perspective, that tells you that they are very, very wasteful as a country. Okay, at least the data shows that Australians, on an individual capacity, can be rather wasteful when it comes to their per person or per capita emissions. Now, this is a graph that shows the share of global carbon dioxide emissions that comes from fuel combustion. That means the use of oil and gas. China takes up the bulk with 38%, followed by the United States. Now, keep in mind, you need oil and gas to sort of fuel your factories and run your cars and all these things. Although this data is quite dated at this point, it's 2015, what it tells us is that we are still living in a world that relies heavily on oil and gas. Okay, we're still living in a world that relies heavily on oil and gas. And it's responsible for a lot of deaths and millions of people getting sick every year due to asthma, lung cancer, heart diseases, causing risk in pregnancy. And of course, every year we still get this problem, right? If you're living in the Southeast Asia region, you know what I'm talking about. Every year, in a certain months and time of the year, there will be a high number of air pollution coming in because of the forest burning that goes on in Indonesia. Okay, the reason they do that is to sort of burn the land, fertilize it so that it's ready for any sort of agricultural work. Now, it's easy for us to sort of point the finger in Indonesia and say, you know what, you guys are not doing it right. You guys are sort of causing all these problems. And it's easy for us to do that, but we don't stop and think about the solution. Remember, these are very large scale plantations we're talking about. And they do not have the technology to solve this problem on a short-term basis. And if you tell them to just stop doing it just like that, what happens is that they're going to run out of food. They are not going to have enough income to feed their own families. Okay? So while we do have this problem, it's always going to be an issue of supply and demand. Okay? It's always going to go back to the issue of what is the type of economy that we're living in? What is the type of economy that we're living in? Okay? Causing all the problems. These are not photoshopped, by the way. I have a student before that tells me that is actually what really happened. Okay, that's a real situation right here. Okay, so a little bit on nuclear energy. Nuclear here is, I'm talking about not in the sense of nuclear weapon, yeah? I'm talking about the potential of using nuclear energy as a sort of like a replacement, as a energy alternative to oil and gas, for example. There is risk from the use of nuclear energy. Because the main concern is about disposal of nuclear waste. We've all heard about the terrible, terrible leak that happened and the explosion that happened in Fukushima plant in Japan. Okay, and the resulting leakage, of course, went around to the sea areas. So if you can see the highlighted areas here, those are the results in terms of the leakage from the Fukushima plant. Okay, and while it may not have a direct effect on humans, it will affect the marine life. Okay, and as you know, if it affects the marine life, it affects the fishes. If it affects the fishes, you cannot sell those fishes. Can't sell it, you have an issue of waste again, right? You have an ethical issue of how do you deal with those waste again, and how long does it take for the marine life in that affected area to recover from the radioactive waste? Okay, so these are all questions that we need to ask ourselves. How do we deal with all these things? Okay, at the end of the day, like it or not, us humans, we are causing climate change. Okay, climate change is happening and it's heating up the planet. And I've mentioned earlier in the chapter, right, that human activity is heating up the planet really bad, right? And in the last 10 years has been the longest 10 years, hottest 10 years on record. Okay, so it's not really good news in terms of how the climate is doing, or in terms of how the climate is working out. Okay, spring comes on average 1 week earlier than in the past. Weather patterns are becoming more erratic. And what that means is that when it's cold, it's really cold. When it's hot, it becomes really hot. So the extremes of weathers are becoming a lot more extreme, if I can put it that way, a lot more extreme. And of course, the Arctic ice sheets are melting, the world glaciers are melting, all result in an increase of sea level. And you know what happens when you increase sea level, you get a lot of cities going underwater. And even Singapore is taking its steps now towards climate change to sort of try and build up walls or build up higher barriers to prevent sea level rises from affecting our shores. Okay, so the problem is there. Okay, we just need to think about what are the possible solutions that we can do to mitigate all these problems. It is still not too late. Okay, let me put that into perspective. Yeah, it is still not too late for us to do something to slow down the effects of climate change and possibly even reverse all these effects. Okay? We've seen a little bit of bits and pieces of news out there on how climate change has, on how the effects of COVID-19 has actually been beneficial for climate change. If I can bring up this data right here, right? You notice a NASA satellite, right, actually sees the air pollution drop over northeastern US amid the coronavirus outbreaks. And whether we whatever our views are when it comes to all these climate change, one thing's for sure is that when people stay home, they don't go out as much, they don't drive the car as much, the air starts clearing up. Okay, so when industry takes a break, the earth starts working again to repair itself. So based on that approach, right, you could see a few silver linings, a few benefits that come from the terrible tragedy and the horror of COVID-19, okay, the ones that we are facing right now. So what are the possible solutions that we can take? That's what we'll explore next. So who should be paying the price when it comes to the cost of environmental protection? Okay, should we look at some ways that businesses can do or can adopt to sort of reduce the impact of environmental damage due to the outputs or the pollution that is caused by their businesses? So we're going to look at a few things here. Businesses' responsibilities in regard to environmental degradation, resource depletion, and a little bit on the abuse of animals for commercial purposes. Okay, so first thing is that as business operates, it functions within an ecological system. Think of it as sort of like an interweb of dependency when it comes to structure of ecosystems. In school, you've probably been introduced to the concept of the food chain, right? In this case, it's similar. And businesses and ecology forms part of the chain of cause and effect. Okay, predators and prey, producers, consumers, hosts and parasites, they're all interlinked together, creating sort of like an interlocking mechanism. And like it or not, there has to be some kind of a checks and balances in order to result in a system that is stable. Okay, so every living organism has an effect and is affected by the environment. Okay, and humans, being the dominant species on Earth, we possess the power to damage, okay, or to make good when it comes to the stability of the natural ecosystem. And many human commercial activities obviously refers to the business activities, have very unpredictable and sometimes often disruptive consequences for the ecosystem. A good case in point is our use of oil and gas. Okay, the reliance of industry on oil and gas have, of course, one thing, increased the demand for oil and gas, resulting in high prices of oil. At the same time, if the greenhouse gases that it produce, oil and gas, and including the coal industry as well, COAL, have really very disruptive consequences for the overall ecosystem, causing a lot of damages. Just look at the damage that can be caused by an oil spill, for example. It can be so bad that it takes years and years of repair work to actually look at a possibility of even improving the damages that it has caused, that an oil spill can cause. So part of this problem actually comes from how businesses actually view the environment or view natural resources. And one of those views is actually seeing the environment or perceiving the environment as a resource that is continuously free and comes in unlimited supply. Okay? Viewing the environment as something that is free and unlimited. That's a big problem. Okay? And that leads to my next theory here, which is called the tragedy of the commons. Okay? If you have your notes with you, just try to highlight that in your notes. Tragedy of the commons. Now, what tragedy of the commons here means is that if you look at the diagram on the table right now, you'd notice that there are 4 squares that are blue, right? Now, each of those squares represents a piece of land, okay? And you, as the business owner, owns one piece of those land, and the other 3 would represent your competition or other business owners, okay? Now, imagine putting yourself in a business of agriculture, okay? And either you're doing agriculture or you're in the business of selling cattle, okay? Or cows, if you put it that way. So, in this context, each of all these stars that you see on the field represents one cattle, okay? Now, if you're in the business of selling milk, okay, the more cattle you have, more milk you produce, right? Simple as that. Now I have about 6 cattle within your field. Okay, so 6 would produce a certain amount of milk every single day or every single month. And in order to increase your output, to get more money, to have more business, think about this. Your land is not getting any bigger, yeah? So all you can do is, again, increase the number of cattle in your piece of land, okay, in that finite piece of land that you have. So as you increase the resources available in that land, the grass that the cattle eat, for now, it might still be able to sustain them. Okay, they might not be able to move as freely as before, but it's still relatively okay, and it can sustain the number of additions that you put into the piece of land. And there, when your output would also increase, and your profit would also increase. So your cost remains relatively low. You don't have to buy something new. You just have to increase the number of cattle you put within that land. But the more you do this, okay, you're gonna find yourself with less and less resources to feed the number of cattle that you want, especially if you double the number again. So you're gonna find yourself in a possible scenario where your land can no longer sustain the amount of output that you wish to produce. And what can happen is that the land becomes unusable, dry, brittle, okay, and it reaches the point of no return. And when that happens, it's commonly known as the tragedy of the commons. Okay, it is this attitude where businesses want to see natural resources as something free and unlimited. Think of the air, think of the sea, think of land, right? Think of the forests that we have. We tend to take clean air for granted. And if we do nothing to protect the ozone layer, for example, to protect the cleanliness of our air, at some point, right, the air is going to become bad, polluted, possibly unbreathable. And when it reaches that point, it becomes a tragedy for humankind. It becomes the tragedy for all common people. Okay, seawater, for example. If we keep thinking of the sea as a way for us to throw our rubbish and throw our outputs, our chemical waters, our chemical excretion, if we keep treating the seawater that way, one fine day, it's going to affect the fishes, it's going to affect the marine life, and the seawater becomes untreatable, or worst case, unusable. Okay? And when that happens, coral life dies, sea life ceases to exist, and it becomes a tragedy of the commons again. Okay? So we don't want it to reach this sort of stage. You don't want it to reach this sort of stage. So what can you do to control it? And what can you do to pay the cost of pollution control? First of all, you need to ask a few questions. Who is responsible? Obviously, in this case, it is largely due to end users, and mostly industry and businesses. Okay? Who are the ones that are free riders versus a social contract? Okay? How do you divide the bill? You need to ask all these questions. You must first do a cost-benefit analysis, right? Measure human being well-being versus the cost and other benefits. Benefits that are especially difficult to calculate in environmental matters because they often take an ecstatic form. It's very hard to calculate the benefits when it comes to environmental matters, because usually for us humans, we tend to just look at the environment and say, oh, okay, it looks fine, nothing needs to be done. Okay, you also need to sort of have an assessment when it comes to the costs and benefits and the subjects to various factors of uncertainty and significantly influenced by the values that ones hold. Okay, so in essence, when you're thinking of the price and the cost of pollution control, you always have to consider the cost and the benefit of the steps that you're going to take. Okay, how much does it cost to clean up the environment, and what is the overall benefit that you'll get? Obviously, the moral answer to that would be, yes, you should do it. okay, no matter the cost. But understand that we live in a capitalist society. There's always an issue of cost benefit. Okay, there's always going to be that question of cost versus benefit. So there's a few things you can do when you're trying to achieve environmental goals: regulations, incentives, pricing mechanisms, or a combination of all three methods that you see in front of you. Okay, so we're going to look at one by one briefly. Let's talk a bit about regulation. Regulation makes use of direct public regulations and control in determining how pollution bill is paid. Essentially, you're sort of creating laws, you're putting into writing certain laws and regulations that company must follow. And if they break it, then they have to foot the bill. They have to pay fines. Okay, those are regulations. A simple one in Singapore is the whole regulation where you couldn't litter right around the city, and if you're caught littering, then you have to pay a fine of like $5,000 or community service or something. That's a regulation. Okay, another version of regulation is, if I can pull up the system here, is the whole concept of pollution control. So in America, part of the regulation is called the Clean Air Act. Okay, so I managed to pull this up for you to see. So the Clean Air Act, it was, I think, done during 1990 or something. Okay, and since then it has gone through a few amendments, a few changes. But part of the Clean Air Act is a list of regulations that companies or organizations need to follow in order not to break the rules of pollution control. Okay, so that's part of the Clean Air Act and an example of regulation. Another one would be incentives. That's when government gives firms tax breaks or matching them with grants. For example, the idea of this is that it avoids the government fining you for anything. Okay, it's more of a situation where if you take initiatives to operate your business in a greener manner, then the governments might give you a tax break, or even better, giving you certain amount of money or subsidies to do something or to run your business. Okay, and the benefit of this is that it does minimize government interference by a fair bit, and it gives way to a lot of voluntary action. New startups, new businesses can sort of think of ways they can reduce costs by figuring out how they can run their business in a greener way. It tends to be a slower process, because it takes time for the government to approve certain things, to sort of get the money rolling into your bank account, but it is a good way to go. And the problem with this is that, think of it this way: if you are an existing polluter, okay, and you take a step or two to sort of reduce the pollution of your business, then in theory the government still has to sort of subsidize and pay you for it, even though you're still polluting. So the downside of this is that it can be sort of perceived as a subsidy for polluters as well. Next up are pricing mechanisms, also known as a carbon tax. This is when you charge firms according to the level of pollution that they produce. Now, this is very popular and has likely been applied to many countries around the world. Okay, has been adopted by many countries around the world. What it does is that it places the pollution cost control directly on the polluters. What that means is that if your businesses, at its very core, causes a lot of pollution, then you're going to have to pay higher tax. But if your business is a very clean one, it's a fairly clean one, and if you can reduce the amount of pollution that your business has, or the output pollution that your business has, then that directly will reduce the tax that you pay. Okay, so there are many organizations that have done this. Let me pull this up for you. So you look here, right? This is an effect on carbon tax, and a push for a lot of organizations to take the opportunity during the COVID-19 crisis to reduce their pollution and to sort of pay less tax as a result from causing less pollution. Okay, so there is a certain amount of benefit, okay, or silver lining, as I said earlier, that came from this whole COVID-19 situation. It did sort of stabilize the environment to a large extent. Another version, right? This is a Singapore's version of regulation or pollution control. This one is, going back to the notes here, is a version of pollution permits. Okay? That's where you set limits on the amount of pollution a firm can produce. This is almost similar to regulation. Okay? But the only difference is that your business can only run, this is part of the business operation permit that is given out by the government. And what it states within that permit is that your business is allowed to produce a certain amount of pollutants every single year. Okay? And that amount is clearly stated within that permit. And if you increase or if you sort of go beyond that amount that is stated, then you're sort of running the risk of closure or a hefty fine. Okay? And these are all stated in the pollution control licensing system within NEA. Okay? So you can find it in this website as well. So it's all stated there very clearly. So you see all the licensing permit fees and all these things. These are all here. Okay? So going back to this, understand that no one solution is ideal. Okay? You can have pricing mechanisms, you can have regulations, you can have pollution permits all at once. And it's a matter of how governments calibrate all these steps to make sure that they find a good middle ground for businesses to operate within reasonable means in terms of the amount of pollution that they produce. Okay? So just to sort of recap the entire chapter, it's to understand the correlations that businesses have with regard to pollution and climate change and global warming, the viewing of the environments as free and unlimited, that has led to a situation, sometimes a situation where it's a point of no return, right? It's too late even for any steps to be taken to repair the damages. And we also looked into a few steps where organizations can sort of do, or steps that governments can have organizations take to reduce the impact of greenhouse gases or reduce the impact of pollution or environmental damage. These include regulations, pricing mechanisms, pollution permits, carbon taxes, so on and so forth. Okay, so that about sums it up for the entire chapter of environment and business ethics. Okay, so I'll see you guys in the next chapter.